This is a podcast by the Straits Times.
Hello, I'm Lynda Hong, Assistant Podcast Editor at the Straits Times. Here is a statistic that might surprise you. A recent analysis of various surveys found that Asia has the highest rate of problematic pornography use in the world. That's nearly 1 in 5 people. But here's the catch. We actually have no idea what the exact number is here in Singapore because we've never done a national survey on it. Is it because the topic is so taboo? In this episode, we'll talk about the deafening, uncomfortable silence in our homes and schools and the dopamine trap of online pornography. This comes after the government sounded the alarm. During the Committee of Supply debate in March, Senior Parliamentary Secretary Eric Chua called for a rigorous study in Singapore on how prevalent the problem is, highlighting how kids as young as 12 have sought psychiatric help. And with smartphones providing instant, anonymous and inexpensive access to extreme content, the old methods of cautious parenting and school web filters are failing. How can more be done, and how is this becoming a health issue? To discuss more, I'm joined by an expert who has researched on porn addiction in Asia. Associate Professor of Psychology at James Cook University, Singapore, Peter Chew, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Why would you actually look at porn addiction? Why was this a focus for you? I mean, have you come across that when you were growing up? What was it like for you then to make you, want to look at this as a focus for your study?
If you go on websites right now, there are many web pages devoted to porn addiction, treatment, so on and so forth. And very often, many of the information there is not really factually correct. They are there partly because many of those websites, they are funded and run by Christian organizations. And of course, partly because of their religious prescriptions, they will portray this in a negative light. And I think that is not good for someone who is growing up and actively seeking help for this particular condition. So part of the reason why I'm studying this is to ensure that we really get this right and to identify the consequences correctly.
There have been reports that those seeking help for pornography behaviors have more than doubled compared with pre-COVID levels, and most of their clients are in their 20s. And since we don't have a national survey yet, how prevalent do you think this problem is in Singapore?
So based on our analysis, I think a conservative estimate would be about 10%, which is 1 out of 10. But there are 2 caveats to this particular number. The first one is that porn addiction is not a recognized disorder by the American Psychiatric Association or the World Health Organization. So the diagnosis criteria are still tentative currently. The second one is that very often those number does not take into account that some people seek help or they report that they've addicted to pornography because of what their behavior is doing, and their prescription of their religion. So what happens is that they are viewing pornography, but their religion says that it is wrong. And it is this conflict that drives them to seek help rather than being addicted to pornography itself.
So we are saying that, but then how do we actually know that a person is actually addicted to pornography? What are some of the telltale signs?
So some telltale signs would involve viewing pornography as an important part of their life, and where they might turn away from other activities, their usual hobbies, for example, just to spend time on pornography. Another telltale sign could be conflicts within the family or with significant others at work and so on and so forth. But basically what happens is that their pornography use is causing problems for at least one domain of their life.
What are some of these effects of porn on a teenager's brain? Like, why is the dopamine hit more devastating to a teenager because their emotional maturity hasn't fully formed yet compared to an adult?
Yeah, that is one of the major reasons. There are actually 2 reasons why the impact is much more severe for them. The first one has to do with the lack of maturity when it comes to their brain functions. So when it comes to the brain, the reward systems, the one you're talking about, the dopamine hit, is developed first. So we feel rewarded when we do something nice, eating, drinking, in this case, viewing pornography. So that is developed. They can feel rewarded, they feel good. But when it comes to adolescence, their prefrontal cortex, which is the area directly behind your forehead, is not developed yet. The prefrontal cortex is involved in stopping risky behaviors. It's like a braking system. So I want to do this, the prefrontal cortex will tell you, no, it is risky. But for them, it is not developed yet, and so they tend to engage in risky behaviors. They tend to be more impulsive, for example. And over time, that could lead to severe consequences like porn addiction, for example. So that's one of the that's one of the major reasons. The second one has to do with the internal scripts that they have. So as we grow up, we form scripts and models about how the world is like.
As in a script, like a written script where you can write your narrative, you mean?
Yeah, but it is an internal one.
Okay.
So a script could be, how would a relationship look like? And they will look at their parents. If they grow up having loving parents, for example, then there will be their script for how a relationship should be. When they watch pornography, however, their internal script for a relationship and sex changes. For example, they will grow up having unrealistic standards for sex and relationship. They could end up watching more pornography so that they can achieve the same dopamine hit. Over time, this will not be good for them, especially when it comes to long-term relationship and satisfaction.
So they're more desensitized because they've been exposed to very high levels of stimulation, for instance.
Yes.
I see.
They will need more extreme forms, for example, just to get the same hit, dopamine hit. Yeah.
Does that mean that porn addiction, right, would likely make young people turn to sex crimes like voyeurism or taking upskirt photos? There was a report before recently that this man was actually jailed for taking upskirt pictures. Or are we just conflating two different issues?
No, this is an interesting one. And it's an age-old question, actually, all the way since 30 years, 40 years ago. The issue here is this. The police will only raid the homes of those who have committed crimes. So they take upskirt photos, the police raid their house, and they find pornography. And so the general public will look at this and they would link the two together. But very often, it is a third variable that is causing both of them. For example, sometimes there could be psychological factors. This person might have difficulties with intimacy and attachment. And so it is these difficulties that would drive this person to take upskirt photos and view pornography. But those two behaviors are not linked. Sometimes they could have an underlying disorder, perhaps a paraphilia disorder, that could be driving those behaviors as well. So we must be a little bit careful not to confuse the two. Most of the research here is actually quite inconclusive. In fact, there's some research that will show the opposite, that viewing pornography might actually help with certain crimes because they provide a somewhat private and legal outlet for them to address their tendencies.
What are some of these such examples would you be able to cite?
For example, let's say you have a person who has a strong desire to sexually assault someone. Let's say. But this person is able to satisfy that desire by watching pornography of this particular nature. And in doing so, he wouldn't commit the actual crime itself.
Ah, okay.
Yes.
I see.
Yeah. And lastly, I think it is interesting to think about hypotheticals. So if you think about the opposite, suppose the police right now is to raid 100 homes of upstanding citizens, they are going to find pornography at least 95% of the time. When it comes to pornography use, we don't have such surveys in Singapore, but surveys across other countries, pornography usage can be up to 100%.
100%? Okay.
Up to 100%, depending on the region. So if they rate 100 homes right now, they are going to find a high volume and quantity of pornography, but these people are not going to commit any crimes.
So pornography addiction and pornography, it sounds like pornography itself sounds like it's a very innocent, maybe, should we say a pastime in viewing it, versus the addiction itself then. So younger people would tend to have a higher propensity for becoming addicted than adults.
Yes, younger individuals, partly because their brain is not mature yet, they are at risk for developing such addictions. Adults are at risk as well, but not as much as them. So I think the key here is to distinguish between non-problematic pornography use and problematic pornography use.
Right. And if someone, for instance, a teenager is may be addicted to porn? What's the treatment or rehabilitation like?
Right now, there's actually not much research on treatment, partly because it's not officially recognized as a disorder. Some of the treatment that I've seen, they center on something known as acceptance commitment therapy. So the main idea here, as the name suggests, is to accept those urges, is to accept those behaviors, and to understand that you can't really control some of those things. What you can control, however, is to identify when you experience those urges and what are you going to do about it. And very often, that's where the commitment comes in. They will be committed to, let's say, reduce their viewing by X number of hours, for example. And so that's basically what acceptance commitment therapy does. And so far, initial results seem quite promising in reducing pornography addiction.
And Mr. Eric Chua called for a rigorous national prevalence survey. How do you think this survey should look like then?
The first thing is that we need a representative sample of Singaporeans. So representative in terms of a nice gender distribution, 50-50. We would have ethnic distribution as per our census, as well as, more important here, the religious distribution. So that has to do with the sample. When it comes to the questionnaire itself, there are quite a few psychometrically validated questionnaires that we use in psychology that we can use to assess problematic pornography use, religiosity, and moral incongruence. So for the last one, moral incongruence, what it does is to capture that conflict between what their behavior is and what their religion tells them otherwise. So if you can capture these three variables, you would be better able to understand the phenomenon.
So that would actually try to make even things out in terms of their addiction and their views towards porn. Would that be the case then?
Yes, we can identify who is having problems, and more important, who is really having problems with pornography itself, and who is experiencing conflict because of their religion. And this can be two separate things.
I see. Looking at young people being addicted to porn, Mr. Chua also mentioned that he thinks that it mostly started because of teenagers or young people being very curious about sex. So in terms of sex education in Singapore, how should schools and families approach this uncomfortable conversation about sex or even pornography addiction with young people?
I think the first step for both parents and schools is that they must take the initiative and control the narrative. Because whether you do it or not, they will go online to look for information, and some of those might be inaccurate. So when it comes to parents, for example, they can inculcate media literacy amongst their kids to let them know that pornography is an unrealistic depiction of what is a healthy, loving relationship. When it comes to schools, there can be better sex education, for example.
And speaking of sex education, then how should our sex education curriculum change if teenagers are going online to find out what sex is about?
When it comes to changes here, there are three things that are very important. The first one has to do with the content. So the content has to be based on evidence. So in this case, one important note is that you might have to keep religion out of the process, and you arrange your content based on what works. And if it does, then we will do it. The second has to do with whether it is going to be abstinence-based. Basically, we are telling students to avoid sex or wait until after marriage, for example. That is abstinence-based versus comprehensive sex education, which will include everything. Things like, for example, the use of contraceptives, STDs, what happens if you have an unwanted pregnancy, for example. So basically the whole course of that process. So comprehensive-based programs are much more effective when it comes to reducing teenage pregnancies, STDs, and so on. And the last one has to do with the mode. Very often, it is done face-to-face. And I think that can be awkward for the people involved. It would be good if we can do it in a digital format. Some countries have done it, like Hong Kong. They have done it online via a game. So all students will log on to the game and they will play those particular scenarios. And they will choose the options from those scenarios. And they will explain why the option is wrong or why is it correct, for example. So if you can make such changes, you'll make it easier for students to engage in the programs.
So, what is a healthy way to talk about porn? And what should Singapore's national guideline be for teachers, parents, family, to approach these topics to their young?
I think for students, for children, for example, it will be much more challenging. I think, of course, you can outright say that you shouldn't view it, for example. But it is very difficult to enforce that. And sometimes when you say no to it, for example, you actually make it more desirable because they're interested to find out, why am I not allowed to do this? So very often it'll be much easier or safer to let them know that this exists and that it is not good, and you explain why to the child. I mean, of course, the explanation has to be much more simpler because they're children, and along the way you will scale up and improve the depth of the explanations. That will be for the children. But for adults, I think it's important that we do not demonize, so to speak, this particular form of media. It is just like games and social media, right? They are here to stay. What matters is how we engage in them in a responsible manner.
And would we be able to talk about, say, for instance, if the national guidelines should be steered more towards religion, or should it be non-religious then? I mean, you've actually mentioned just now about not bringing in religion. But what could you maybe elaborate why we shouldn't bring in religion or the moral implications towards having sex then?
Okay. For example, in certain countries, certain religious organizations, they have been quite vocal about the kind of sex education that they want. And not surprisingly, they will advocate for abstinence-only sex education. But the evidence shows that it will result in worse outcomes, higher teenage pregnancy, for example. So there's a tension between what they want and what actually works. And so when it comes to education, we must favor what works over what they really want. Other things would include things like what happens if there's unwanted pregnancy. In comprehensive programs, they have hotlines and they will present options to the person, right? You can do this, you can do that, and so on. But from the viewpoint of many religions, from some religions actually, abortion is wrong and they wouldn't want hotlines for that included in the program. But we know that sometimes that is an option that you must present, especially if someone is underage, for example.
Okay. And also, what's the policy way forward then? Like Mr. Chua actually concluded in his speech that if technology has industrialized temptation, we must industrialize resilience. In your opinion, what does this industrializing resilience actually look like?
I think before we can develop resilience, we must be aware of what we are fighting against. And that will require distinguishing between normal pornography use and pornography addiction. That's the first step. The second one is to ensure that we do not make pornography a forbidden fruit. I understand that Singapore banned 100 pornography websites, I think, as a symbolic gesture. But those kind of ban doesn't really do anything. In fact, it just makes it more desirable as a forbidden fruit, so to speak. So we need to do away with all those things first. When it comes to resilience, we need to make it systematic by building it into our structures and systems. And that will include certain changes when it comes to homes, schools, and communities. So the key here is to really build up things like attention, for example. So within homes itself, strict enforcement of screen time, media literacy, and so on. We can also, this is going to sound like an invasion of privacy, but internet service providers are already collecting the data. If they wanted to, they can easily provide parents with a dashboard of how much time is spent on internet and where are they spending the time on. And the parents can easily see what their kids are doing. When it comes to school, of course, it'll be what we have talked about, things like sex education, comprehensive sex education, and so on. And lastly, at the community level, we can copy whatever we have done for problematic gambling. So, we have a ton of advertisements, right, to raise awareness about problematic gambling. We have hotlines for them to seek help. We have a national council for problematic gambling. All of those kind of things can be replicated because these are, fundamentally speaking, the same type of addictions.
So, but it's just that we are not so comfortable with talking about it, I guess. So, but what are some of the actionable policies then? I mean, when you talk about, for instance, the dashboard, how does it differ from going to view it on the bookmarks or the history of a web browser then?
Because bookmarks and history can be cleared.
I see.
And bookmarks can actually be secured
true.
with certain applications, especially for the younger folks. They're much more tech savvy, I think, than all of us here. And so it's very easy for them to hide their tracks. But if you get actual data from the internet service provider, it'll be much more difficult for them to do so. And you have a clearer picture of actually what is going on.
I see. Well, that's a wrap for In Your Opinion. I'm Lynda Hong. Thank you, Peter, for your insights.
Thank you for having me.
You can email us your thoughts on this issue. Also, if you'd like to read ST articles or opinion columns, these links can be found in our podcast show notes. This episode is edited by Teo Tong Kai. Thanks for listening.
Send your feedback to podcast@sph.com.sg. Find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or within our Straits Times app. Thanks for listening.